2025. These figures matter because inflation affects everyone.
Recording in progress.
It shapes how much food costs at the market, as we know, how far salaries can stretch, how businesses plan, and how government designs policy. Our goal today is very simple: to explain clearly what happened to prices in December 2025, why it happened, and what it means for households, businesses, and policymakers. Now, let's look at the overview. Let's look at the overview of the presentation. In today's presentation, we'll walk you through how inflation is measured, highlight the key inflation outcomes for December 2025, explain what is driving these movements, and then also translate the data into practical insights for households, businesses, and policymakers. Our objective is clarity. Inflation statistics must be understood by all so that we can use the data that is explained to inform our decision-making process. But ladies and gentlemen, before we move on and talk about results, let me begin with a quick explanation of some of the key terms that we'll be using today. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, measures changes in the price of goods and services that households regularly buy. Inflation is the rate at which these prices change over time. Inflation is measured using data on prices of 307 items in the basket, purchased by households from 57 markets with 8,337 outlets. The items are ordered in 13 divisions, 44 groups, 98 classes, and 156 subclasses. The weight reference period is 2017, but the price reference period has been updated to 2021 to reflect the new regions we have. That's the 6 new regions we have. And in today's presentation and interpretation, we'll focus on 2 measures: year-on-year inflation, which compares prices today with prices in the same month 1 year ago. It also answers the question as to how much more or less is life today compared to a year earlier. The second term we'll be focusing on is month-on-month inflation, which compares prices from 1 month to the next, and also shows how inflation is moving from, in the case of December, from November to December. And that shows short-term movements in prices. We also analyze inflation by food and non-food, goods and services, locally produced versus imported items, and then we'll look at the inflation figures from regional perspective and also from individual product perspective. When we do this, it helps us understand not just how inflation is moving, but why. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in recent times, we've introduced a number of innovations to ensure that we can all understand the inflation figures much better. We continue to strengthen how inflation data are presented. So in this release, we'll provide deeper decomposition of inflation into goods and services, contributions to inflation, annual average inflation, and then we'll also provide some recommendations. We'll provide you with some visual infographics to help understand and also quickly digest what the inflation figures are. These innovations are designed to make inflation data clearer, more transparent, and easier for everyone to interpret. Now let me jump into the numbers. The CPI for December 2025 stood at 261.7, up from 248.3 in December 2024, translating into a year-on-year inflation rate of 5.4% for December 2025. This means that on average, goods and services cost 5.4% more than they did in December 2024. This result is significant, as inflation has now declined for 12 consecutive months. It fell 2025, and from 23 of 18.4 percentage points in 1 year. It is also the lowest inflation rate since the CPI was rebased in 2021. This steady decline signals sustained shift toward price stability and improving macroeconomic conditions. On a month-on-month basis, inflation in December 2025 was 0.9%. This means that prices increased by 0.9% between November and December 2025. While short-term movements remain, they are now occurring within stable and downward long-term trend. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at inflation by component. Now, we see that breaking inflation into components would usually help us see where the relief is strongest and where pressures persist. The data shows that inflation declined across most major components. Food inflation, non-food inflation, goods inflation, and inflation for both locally produced and imported items all eased compared to November 2025 and December 2024. Now, let's look at food versus non-food inflation. Food inflation on a year-on-year basis fell to 4.9% in December 2025, down from 6.6% in November 2025 and 27.8% in December 2024. This represents a 22.9 percentage point decline over the year. This matters because food accounts for about 43% of household spending. Lower food inflation directly eases pressure on household budgets. However, food prices increased by 1.1% between November and December 2025. Now, this is telling us that while long-term pressures have eased, short-term movements remain. Non-food inflation eased to 5.8% in December, down from 6.1% in November and 20.3% a year earlier. Thus, non-food inflation fell by 14.5 percentage points between December 2024 and December 2025. Month-on-month, non-food prices rose by 0.6%, indicating moderate pressure. Together, these trends show broad-based disinflation across both food and non-food categories. Thus, they reflect broad-based easing in price pressures, rather than improvements driven by a single category. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's disaggregate the food inflation into its components. And we see that food inflation is across all major subclasses, led by vegetables, cereals, fish, and meat products. Month to month, prices fluctuated due to seasonal factors, but by December, most food groups showed modest increase or declines. The slowdown in food inflation was broad-based. Now, let's also look at the trends in food and non-food inflation. And we see here that food and non-food inflation both declined steadily over the year, with food inflation falling from 27.8% in December 2024 to 4.9% in December 2025, and non-food inflation from 20.3% to 5.8%. Month to month, prices fluctuated, but the direction is very clear. Inflation pressures have eased, with food inflation falling faster and price stability taking hold. Now, let's look at goods and services. We see that goods inflation slowed to 5.8% in December 2025, down from 7.3% in November and 23.1% in December 2024. Thus, goods inflation fell by 17.3 percentage points between December 2024 and December 2025. Goods account for nearly 3/4 of the CPI basket. So this slowdown provides relief where it matters most to consumers. Goods prices increased by 0.8% over the month. That's between November and December 2025. Services inflation rose slightly to 4.5% in December, up from 3.8% in November, but still lower than its level of 15.4% in December 2024. Thus, we've seen services inflation actually fall by 10.9 percentage points between December 2024 and December 2025. Month on month, we saw services prices increased by 0.9%. That's between November 2025 and December 2025. Now, let me turn to locally produced and imported items. Inflation for locally produced items declined from 6.8% in November 2025 to 5.9% in December 2025, and from 26.4% in December 2024. This is a 20.5 percentage point reduction over the year. Inflation for imported items also eased, falling from 5% in November 2025 to 4.3% in December 2025, and from 18% a year earlier. This is a 13.7 percentage points decline over the 12 months. This tells us that easing price pressures are coming from both domestic production and imported items. Let me now turn to regional inflation dynamics. Inflation is not the same across the country. In December 2025, the Eastern region recorded the highest year-on-year inflation at 11.2%, up slightly from the November rate of 10.8%, but down from 16.8% a year earlier. The Savannah region recorded the lowest inflation at minus 1.2% in December 2025. This means that prices actually fell by 1.2% in the Savannah region between December 2024 and December 2025. If you compare this with the near zero inflation in November 2025, that's an improvement. And it's even a greater improvement if you compare it to the inflation rate of 33.8% recorded a year ago. Month on month, data show that 3 regions, namely Northern, Western North, and Upper East, actually saw prices declining, with the rest of the regions experiencing modest price rises. These differences reflect variations in supply conditions, transport costs, storage capacity, and market access. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at regional inflation dynamics. And here we see that the top 5 regional contributors to inflation, namely Eastern region, Central region, and Central region, and Western region, altogether contributed over 80% to overall inflation, highlighting the importance of regional dynamics in national inflation outcomes. Eastern region alone contributed 21.3% to the overall inflation of 5.4%. Greater Accra contributed 17.6%, Ashanti 17%, Central 12.6%, and Western 12.5%. Again, if we look at the regional dynamics, we see that the top 5 high inflation regions, namely Eastern region, Northeast, Western, Volta, and Central, however, contributed about 55% to the overall inflation in December 2025. So this means that it is not necessarily the top 5 high inflation regions that are contributing the most to inflation. As I mentioned earlier, the 5 regions that are contributing the most to inflation are Eastern, Greater Accra, Ashanti, Central, and Western. And we see that they are doing so largely because they have relatively big weights in the basket. Now, let's look at contributions to inflation. And here, let me first explain contributions. A contribution tells us how much a particular item or a group of items affect the overall inflation based on how important it is in household spending. In December 2025, the top 5 contributors to inflation in terms of items were charcoal, green plantain, smoked herrings, cinema, and cultural services, as well as ginger. If you pick these top 5 items together, they accounted for over 40% of overall inflation in December 2025. These are items that many households consume regularly, so changes in their prices have a strong impact on inflation. Again, let's look at the top 5 highest and the bottom 5 lowest inflation items. Now, looking at inflation rates themselves, we see that the highest inflation items recorded very large price increases. In fact, the top 5 high inflation items are ginger, which recorded an inflation rate of 76.7%. Green plantain, inflation rate of 69.4%. Charcoal, inflation rate of 66.8%. Cinema and cultural services, inflation rate of 49.3%. And avocado pear, inflation rate of 42.8%. Together, these 5 items contributed about 1/3 of the overall inflation of 5.4% in December 2025. At the same time, several items recorded sharp price declines or negative inflation rates. The bottom 5 low inflation items are garden eggs, whose prices reduced by 56.7%. Kontomire, whose prices reduced by 51.9%. That's between December 2024 and then December 2025. Fried fish, whose prices reduced by 44.5%. Pawpaw, whose prices reduced by 43.6%. And cabbage, whose prices reduced by 43.2%. Altogether, the prices of these 5 items pulled inflation down by 8%. This means that without these price drops, inflation would have been higher. Now, let's look at the drivers of inflation for December 2025. We see that inflation pressures are coming down, but also they're coming from across the spending divisions. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, which carry the largest weight, recorded a sharp decline and remained the single biggest contributor to inflation, followed by housing and utilities. In fact, most divisions saw year-on-year inflation ease between November and December, while month-on-month movements were mixed. Overall, inflation pressures are increasingly concentrated in a few key items, or few key divisions, with broad easing across the rest of the basket. So what this means is that if you want to target inflation and fight it, you know exactly where to hit. In summary, with regards to the key drivers of inflation, the data shows that the key drivers were: 1, a strong decline services costs, and 5, but not the least, persistent regional disparities driven by supply and access conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the key takeaways in today's presentation on the December 2025 inflation numbers? The key takeaway is that inflation is falling steadily. Price pressures are easing broadly, but short-term movements and regional differences remain. Now, let me turn to recommendations which are driven by the data that we have collected from the December 2025 inflation. For government, we recommend that it stays the course on fiscal discipline, sustain efforts to stabilize food prices, and target investment in storage, irrigation, transport, and market access to reduce regional disparities. For businesses, with inflation easing, we recommend that businesses should invest in efficiency. They should strengthen local supply chains, reduce inefficiencies and unnecessary costs, and translate savings into more stable prices for consumers. And for households, with inflation easing, families can plan their budgets with greater confidence. This is a time to track spending on food, rent, and school fees, among others. This is a time to avoid non-essential expenses and set aside small savings whenever possible to strengthen household finances. Before I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express my sincere appreciation to the market players who share price information with us all the time, the market readers who collect data across the country for us, and the hardworking staff of the Ghana Statistical Service. Your dedication and professionalism are the backbone of the credible inflation statistics we produce. As we enter the new year, I wish all Ghanaians and our partners a happy, healthy, and prosperous new year. The steady fall in inflation shows that stability is within reach when informed decisions are guided by reliable data. Let me end by reaffirming our commitment. The Ghana Statistical Service remains fully committed to producing timely, accurate, relevant, and credible statistics. We will continue to strengthen our methods, improve transparency, and communicate clearly so that our data supports evidence-based making and national development. We encourage everyone to explore from our website the detailed CPI bulletin, the QuakeUp annexes, and the infographics developed to give clear visual insights into the numbers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lassa, for presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 81 participants who are online. The CPI for December, inflation figures for December 2025 have been presented. We standing by and ask if you have any question, please raise your hand using the hand icon on the screen, so that I will ask you to unmute so that you can pose your question. If you have any question, please let's see your hand raised up. Okay, Portia Ofori, please unmute and ask your question.
Okay, so good morning. I am from Monia TV. I don't have a question, but I would like to summarize or take away for us and see as we've been doing, because normally when we are around, we can also get please, I hope. Hello, please.
Osha, can you
hear me?
No, you were not clear.
So I'm saying that usually when we are around, we are able to speak to dogs so that he summarizes everything for us in the local language. That's true. So if there's a way he can do that quickly, just the key takeaways and then the recommendation for us. That
Okay,
is
so
possible.
okay. Thank you. Any other question? So. Portia, can you please lower your hand? Hey, dog, I think I'll participate. Okay, I see another hand. And news, that is from which? Can you please identify yourself and pose your question? Your name here is News. Echo, is it you? So you can unmute and pose your question. News. Please go ahead, News. We can't hear you. Echo, please, I can see you. Are you asking a question? Then unmute because we can't hear you, please.
Francis, the alternative will be for them to type in the chat box as well, if we can hear them. So you can advise them to type in the chat box.
Okay, so we have from Joy FM, George Wiafe, could we have reached a lower inflation rate than this? Because some have predicted about 5.1% for the end year inflation. So that's a question from Joy FM, George Wiafe. He's asking whether we could have reached a lower inflation than the 5.4 that we are seeing, because there have been some projection that inflation would have been 5.1 by end of year. So that is the only question in the chat box now. The second one is inflation had dropped to 5.4. Can we keep it at this level in the coming months? The same from Joy FM. So he's asking again whether inflation could be maintained or keep it at a lower level going into in this year. So that's a please, we're asking that you could stop sharing so that they want to see your face as you respond to the questions. Thank you. There's a third question that is because between November and December 2020. Okay, I think that is a follow-up on the second question that was saying that inflation had dropped to 5.4, and can we keep it at this level in the coming months? Because between November and December 2025, it went up by 0.9%. So Doug, please, if you can go ahead and respond to this. Or maybe I'll add the third question so that you respond to that. There's
Yes,
a third
please add the third question, yeah.
There's a third question from Bloomberg posed by Echo. And he's saying that for size and scope, how does the 5.4 compare to previous lower number? Looks at it's a 24. No, he's saying that it looks like it's a 24-year-old low that we are experiencing. That's a 5.4. But for size and scope, how does this compare to previous lower numbers?
All right.
So please,
So
you
are
can
you
go ahead. Yes, please.
Okay, good. All right. So let me provide some responses to the questions that have come. I've actually noted 4 questions. My colleagues are around to provide some more color to the responses that we'll be providing. So the first question is asking for us to provide some key takeaways in Chi. Let me do that in 1 minute, and then I can go to the rest of the questions. So basically, as usual, I like to do this in fancy. And see, ladies and gentlemen, and then we pay year release inflation figures for the month of December 2025. Now, inflation figures now, year release no on a trade. Yeah, for December 2025, inflation and the year no at 5.4%. Now, more than there, in Zamanabo or Ghana, whether Yerika goods and services, of course, sir, by 5.4% in December 2025. See, the compare last year, December 2024, Nzama book sir 5.4%. Now, them 5.4% yeah, Yerika. Or trader Nzama bi one price is cost sir. Now, Nzama bi so one price is bafum. Kikani nyina buma. Prices no Nzama no bo or cost sir 5.4%. Now, ubeka de 5.4% inflation in. Oye as a papa na de oye bibia or de bibi fa ho ni enya better results. Nti maya kan de the dem inflation the compare previous years yehu de Ghana as because last year same time December 2024 inflation no yet 23.8%. No sure papa. Next is here because of many reasons. Some of them policy, some of them other than policy, many reasons. Inflation now before to 5.4%. So yaza, oye papa, oye as a papa. No, or a bois would be also. Now me di kind car there. So inflation before them now. Not trader or average, because I ain't Ghana Statistical Service. You call 16 regions and you collect data. They measure inflation figures. And see later no crowd me car there. Items will have one price is cost zero. Now items will also have one price is bafum. For example, my example there, you have garden eggs, cocoyam leaves, another my friend contumely, you have your friend and fried fish, you have pawpaw, you have cabbage, tomatoes, you have okra, you have carrots, shea butter, now fresh green pepper. When you one prices, one bar foam, you compare last year, prices in the bar foam. On the other hand, say yefa items bit today ginger, and our green plantain, charcoal, na cinema, na cultural services, na avocado pear, na palm fruits, na coconut, na you offering crab, snail, na cashew. I want so one price is cost, sir. But these are just examples. Into your kicker, them items in now one price. In fact, you monitor 307 items. You kicker them pricing now buma on my inflation of the 5.4%. And basically, summary no on the mizama one. Now yeah, statistical service. Osan de yepede yohun. Aza or cost inflation. My inflation cost for another inflation bar forming. Oh yeah, analysis ni achichim ni yohun baby inflation ni fiba. In the inflation we team chichim between food and non-food inflation. And now you achichim between goods and services inflation. And now the achichim between inflation or items are locally produced and now items are imported the backroom ha. Into yachichem yohun de ever food inflation food inflation will perform to 4.9% in December 2025, down from 6.6% in November 2025. Yeah, for non-food so on inflation will perform to 5.8%, down from 6.1% in November 2025. Yeah, for inflation for goods also performed to 5.8% in December 2025 from 7.3% last month. That's in November 2025. But a services inflation on a cost of kakra to 4.5% in December 2025 from 3.8% in November 2025. Now, locally produced items as well. I also want prices foam to 6.8% to 5.9% in December 2025 from 6.8% in November 2025. The imported items as well, also price in the bar foam from 5.0% in November to 4.3% in December. Now, I could say, regions, regions now one price when inflation bar foam. But regional or recorded highest inflation, Eastern region. Now more recorded lowest inflation, Savannah. Now Savannah cry inflation is negative 1.2%. Anytime my inflation obeko negative in na as trade prices no wabafum. Nzama no bo wabafum. Negative inflation means that the prices themselves have come down. And nzama bo abafum. Until for Savannah in from compared to last year by 1.2%. And so basically, them summary now, Yama with regards to the drivers or the contributors to inflation. And so yes, summarizer, next year, Nzama what drive inflation above form, and our driving inflation to where we are now, 5.4%. No, you better compare 5 things where you're responsible for that. From the data, make them from the data. First, you know there both food and non-food inflation outperform. And that's a major driver. Second, you know there locally produced items, imported items. One inflation item outperform, another big driver. Third, goods inflation, you know also outperform another good driver. Now, fourth, services inflation, but it's still contained. Now, finally, but not the least, in spite of all them reasons here, still regions, eco regions now, inflation variations won't differences won't. But when there will be inflation, even though national inflation is 5.4%. But you have a region that recorded 11 point something percent. No, region Biswa record negative. Into them no variations no wumpa. Into those are the factors that are responsible for the inflation from the data. But or there, medical so there, inflation, the way ocon other factors. These are real sector factors, but other factors so play role, very important role. For example, so aban your fiscal consolidation. Now all you're fiscally disciplined. Now net revenue, ska na expenditure, ska or spend. Now or the 2 year, aya otabua inflation papa. Inti also can home ma inflation figures now abafom no. Yehude wabafom. Now secondly, inflation so aya exchange rate movement or affecting papa. Because some of the items are tom, crafty, abutrini edeba. Na abutri to the one first into as it. A cra or they exchange dollar and now exchange foreign currency needed to deba. Into on foreign exchange, say Sydney is stronger, not the prices, other things being equal, overform. Into exchange rate appreciation and Ghana experience. Year-to-date exchange rate appreciation by end December 2025 was about 40% or 40.something%. And also wabua inflation, so wabafum. Not only the imported items, even locally produced items their inputs are based on nzama yakrani and also price in bafum because of the exchange rate appreciation. Now, third, there are also global factors. Sometimes what play to support the disinflation process. So for example, crude oil day, yakra ba. use at the pump. Nti crude international price of crude oil up it bodes well for inflation. Now it also affects transportation prices well. Nti them nyina edekeka kabom plus the real sector policies or interventions in terms of agri policies, industry policies, services policies, financial sector. Now also now households, now private sector and businesses, one actions and their inactions, help now or support the inflation process. And usually, presentation there, Ghana Statistical Service, kade, ejuma no date ejuma. By the end of the day, or there boa man na Ghana, ejuma no ultimately support decision-making process so that people will use our data to help the national development agenda. Na ejuma no ono wenkosi them da no it means yenwi ejuma na no. Until these days, ejuma bia no ayema recommendation. Na aba recommendations near mine. Until yerika there, inflation figures here you're releasing. Lessons won papa my government. Lessons won for households. Na lessons won for businesses. Government here to ban for the fiscal discipline 2025. Yehu there abana yaze with regards to the numbers that they have come out as a result of the fiscal actions that the government has taken. And yere catcher bande on continue no maintain fiscal discipline 2026 and beyond. Them discipline now you 2025 no. You same discipline and I even see better fiscal discipline. Now secondly, yere advice there aban side on sustain efforts to stabilize food prices. Now food prices so they if they stabilize the food prices are agri here very important. Irrigation here very important. Now farm equipment here very important. Even infrastructure, food, and roads. Now other infrastructure here you bet him that transport baby you produce in demand to the market centers are very important. It's a ban on provide enabling environment. Now them in zaman solve. Now thirdly, your advice about so the on-target investment in storage, not irrigation, transport, access to reduce regional disparities. But businesses, so your advice there, private sector businesses, since inflation labor form up to 5.4%. And see, businesses this year, one make sure they invest in efficiency, one strengthen local supply chains. Now, one translate savings into more stable prices so that consumers can benefit from the inflation also or performing. Now, households, now. Yes, okay, since you release data. Now, inflation, so I perform for 12 consecutive months, you know the inflation perform. Into them now, inflation good for both households, businesses, and even government, because we cannot plan well. You know the inflation is stable. Into since and the families, you better plan year with our budgets with greater confidence. And advice there. This is the time for families and for households to track their spending on food, on rent, on school fees, and then expenditures be papa na panic buying beer on the way. Now what concentrate now we better set aside small money be cry for savings whenever it is possible 1 year then. Into them advice in yedama household businesses na government. Into a summary now academy on my second question. The second question is whether we could have achieved an inflation rate lower than the 5.4% that has been achieved. So in other words, if I heard the question right, some have predicted that inflation would end the year at 5.1%, but the Ghana Statistical Service has reported in December inflation of 5.4%. The question is, could inflation have been lower? The straightforward answer is that the Ghana Statistical Service does not go into the business of projecting inflation. We don't do that. So the projection of inflation is left to the authorities, both the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities. In Zambia, both Bank of Ghana and Ministry of Finance, they work together to do the inflation projection. Our responsibility is to collect the data and report what the data is throwing out. And because we are very extensive in the data collection across all 16 regions and across the length and breadth of the country, we are able to cover about 307 items. And that would give you the most comprehensive data you can ever get in the country on inflation. And then there's a question, third question, can we keep inflation at 5.4% in the coming months? Again, I said earlier that we are not in the business of projecting inflation, we report inflation. But if you ask whether inflation can be kept at 5.4% or even better, the question is, why not? With God, everything is what? Possible. If we stay physically disciplined, if we do what we need to do, we continue to manage the economy prudently, if we exchange rate management yields into currency stability, as we saw in 2025, if we do not record adverse global shocks to some of the variables that affect inflation, if we implement the key real sector interventions in the budget, including agri-related interventions, financial sector-related interventions, industry-related interventions, the 24-hour economy program, and many other special initiatives that have been introduced in the budget, and we implement them religiously, I can tell you that they would have very positive impact on inflation, and they would bode well for sustainability of the inflation figures we are seeing. Then the last question that came for the inflation rate of 5.4%, the question is, in terms of size and scope, how does this compare to previous years? Is it a 24-year low, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so the last time we rebased the CPI was in 2021. So that's the latest fresh rebase figures that we have. We are currently embarking on a rebasing exercise. And when we complete that exercise, we'll be able to have more recent figures for inflation. So even though the width reference is 2017, but the price referencing was updated to reflect the 6 new regions in 2021. So because we did the last rebasing in 2021, we compared from the rebasing period. That said, we can always do a backcast of the rebase inflation figures and compare the 5.4% to it. So that exercise can be done, and then we can then do that comparison for you. So ladies and gentlemen, I think these are the 4 questions I recorded. I don't know if I've responded to all of them, or if there are some that I skipped. So let me know if I skipped some, so we can respond to them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lassa. I think you've responded to the questions. There was another question on Facebook, but I still want something on projection, which you've responded to. It's from Daniel Opong. He wanted to know, does GSS have a medium-term inflation target? And what is the inflation outlook for 2026? But he also wanted to know what is the biggest risk to inflation. But I think you've responded to the projection bits of that. Apart from that, there is no other question now. There's one question. Doc, you remember I predicted inflation will end at around 5%. I also predicted January rate at 4%. Besides what happened to our end of year, okay. So I think is asking about the backers. You've already responded to that, so we will get the as to them. It's just the projection that they made, but not we making, not GSS making. He predicted that it will end around 4%, and he wanted to know what is happening. But I think you've responded to that.
Okay.
So I think the only one is he wanted to know what is the biggest risk to inflation, but I think you even responded to that in your earlier submission. So, ladies and gentlemen, on that, I want to thank you for your participation again, and we thank you, as the government statistician indicated, for your collaboration over last year. And as he said, we believe we're still going to have that collaboration with you. We look forward to having you in the next week to another release. The year has started, and we'll continue to bring more to your doorstep. So on behalf of the government statistician, I want to thank you all again and wish you a happy new year. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.